Good morning, everyone. This is nice. It's a small group. That's okay. We'll have room for conversation, and we can keep it informal. So the name of this session, as you can see, is conservation is private land conservation agreements in civil law countries. It's in the law and policy track. So if that's what you came to see, you're in the right place. If you didn't come to see this, you're welcome to stay. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to jump right in, and we're going to try to get through a number of presentations and a lot of information to leave time for questions at the end. And there will be questions that you're going to have along the way because the countries are different and the approaches are somewhat different. So feel free to write down questions so you remember them because we really do want to be able to answer them at the end. My name is Henry Tepper. I work as an independent land conservation consultant based in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States. And I'm wearing two hats for the panel today. I'll be the moderator, and I'll also be talking about the private land conservation agreement that we have created in Chile. And I serve as the strategic conservation advisor to the Fundación Tierra Austral, which is the most prominent private land conservation NGO working in Chile, working as a land trust. And the subject of our panel is the creation and the use of private land conservation agreements in 5 geographies around the world that use civil law as opposed to common law, so civil law legal systems. The geographies are France, the province of Quebec, in Canada, of course, Chile, the state of Sonora in Mexico, and Catalonia in Spain. And I want to thank, I'm not sure they're here, but I want to thank Phil Tabus and Laura Johnson, working with the ILCN, who helped us sort of shape this panel discussion today. So the use of private land conservation agreements in civil law jurisdictions has really increased in the past 10 years. And so we thought that the ILCN Congress would be an appropriate time and place to kind of do a check-in on the state of the practice with these kinds of agreements. And we could have picked some other geographies around the world, but these are 5 places in the world where private land conservation agreements have really progressed, are very active, and we think are really interesting. And so we've decided to choose these 5 places and conservation leaders in these 5 places who are experts on how they've accomplished this. They're each going to tell their stories differently, which I hope will make things more interesting. But we have asked them to address, let me see if the clicker works. It does not. Can you advance? Oh, there it is, okay. We've asked them to address some core issues, and they'll do that in their own way, and if you don't feel like you're getting enough information, you're free to ask questions at the end, but starting with just describing what the agreement is in their civil law jurisdiction. What are you protecting? Or if the tool is still so new that you haven't protected anything yet, what do you expect to protect? What kinds of land do you protect? Is this a tool that is primarily creating ecological reserves? Are you accommodating sustainable land uses? How does it work in terms of what is the kind of the size of the landscapes that you're protecting? Where are you protecting them in your respective countries or jurisdictions? How did this happen? What was the evolution of thinking about this and the motivation that catalyzed the creation of the agreement? How is it working? Are the number of agreements increasing? Is it not sort of taking hold? Is it increasing awareness of land conservation and shedding light on the need for private or voluntary land conservation in your country? Is it resulting in new organizations and new entities and new energy being devoted to this important need? Why are landowners doing this? Are there incentives that exist for them to do this, either financial incentives, tax incentives, compensation, or other kinds of incentives? And what are the big opportunities? What do you see as really exciting about your agreement and about the evolution of this work? And of course, what are the big challenges? And we all know that there are lots of big challenges. So we're going to start now by hearing, and we've tried to do this in some order, some logical order, and we're going to start with Julie Babin, who is going to talk about her work in France. And so we'll start with Julie, then we will hear from Brice Calais, who will talk about Quebec, then we'll hear about, then I'll talk about Chile. Roberto de la Maza will talk about Sonora in Mexico, which has somewhat of a connection to Chile. And then we'll hear from Matthias Brummer, who will talk about Catalonia in Spain. So Julie, you're up.
Hello, everyone. I'm Julie. I come from France, so I apologize because my English is not very good, but I'll try to do my best for you. I am a director of the French New Foundation in France, was born in November 2030. And we were created by NGOs and whose name Conservatory of Natural Areas. This NGO manage more than 300,000 hectares in France. So we are one of the leaders to the managing of the landscape in France. And we have the support of the national state, and we were recognized to our ability to participate to the objective to the 2030. So for us, the new conservation easement is new. It's not so new, but 8 years is a little old. But we try to do our best to increase the surface we protect. The French conservation easement was called Obligation réelle environnementale. You may have heard these tools of the past ELCN Congress, which was my colleagues, Vanessa Kurugji, who present these tools, but I present too. We are in civil law, and these tools was born in 2016, after a long period of gestation in France, and we have to convince politics and jurists to the utility of create these tools. It's really solid tools for private protection, and how can I say, it's specific because we put obligation to the land, and this obligation are guaranteeing a long-term preservation. There is just one article in France, and the rest is just the contracts law. We have to be imaginative. We have to redact everything. There is no prescription, just a few. The definition of the French conservation easement is a contract by which real estate owner commits to do or to refrain from doing certain action, and I will present you some of them in some landscape we use it. These commitments are attached to the real estate, not to the person of the owners. And for us, it was really, really a big step because our NGO used a lot of contract, but civil contract, and the obligation was the personal obligation. So when the owner changed, whatever the reason, we have to take and agree a new contract. So with this, we can have protection to the long term, and it's the main goal. The global goal of this contract is environmental protection. Yeah, how does it work? It's a contract between a estate owner and you have the other party. The other party, it's limited to 3 categories. You cannot have a physical person. You have obligatory, the other party, a public authority. In France, you have public authority who have agreed ORE or city, and some departments. Public establishment. You have some agency of water and conservatory of the littoral. I don't know how can I say it in English, but I try. And a legal person constituted under private law that acts for the protection of the environment. And we are in this category. This category wasn't defined by the law. So everyone can say, I am to protection. Okay, thank you. And we have several goals to this contract: maintaining, conservation, management, and restoration of biodiversity, element of biodiversity of ecosystem. We can use this contract everywhere. It's built on not built landscape, in city or not. We haven't, the law doesn't restrict the use of the ORE, just the other party. Our NGO cannot work everywhere in France because we haven't enough money to do this, so we adapt. The duration maximal, it's 99 years, and in the contract you need to have this prescription, so the duration, the reciprocal commitment, revision and termination provision. For us, the biggest advantage of these tools is his capacity to be very flexible, because we can adapt to, in each contract, the obligation to the landscape and the biodiversity goal. It's a notary contract. It's really important because this contract, we can be sure it will be transmit, and we cannot lose this contract. For example, we use this contract in agriculture, and we allowed a lot of activity, but we put obligation to zero phyto or extensive grazing, maintain the ponds and trees. We adapt to the necessity and the besoin. Challenge, incentive, and opportunity to finish. It's easy in French. We haven't incentive to agree this contract. So the owner agreed ORE just because they are motivated to take part of the efforts. And we consider that every piece of the French puzzles of biodiversity needs to be protected. So we have to do our best to connect every piece of puzzles, but we have to motivate owners and the others. So our challenge, as I mentioned, it's convince and state owner. The biggest challenge for us, and not just this tool, is to have money, because when you sign the contract, it's just the first step of the story. You need to have money to apply the management of ecology and to be sure the obligations are okay with the owners. So for us, money is really strategic, not just for ORE, but for ORE, obviously. The opportunity to use ORE. We choose our NGO, Conservatory of Natural Areas, decide at the first time to buy and to keep the property of landscape. For now, we have 18,000 hectares in property. But when we cannot buy this landscape, we have to use the strongest tools we have, and ORE are the one. So it's really interesting for us because we can have in the first time ORE and then buy the landscape. We can modulate, as I said. So it's a really really interesting. And recently, the France recognized the part of the ORE in their strategy of protected areas and the objective of the 3030. So for us, it's really it's a kind of incentive because the collectivities are really fond of participate to the effort. In France, we haven't global vision to how many ORE are signed, but in Conservatoire d'Espaces Naturels, we know we have 65 ORE, but is the number of the past year. And this year we work and we have another, but I haven't the right number. It's growing because the strategy is to keep it. How support we needed? Money, as everyone in this Congress, and we are promoting and trying to convince the state that we need reduction on property tax, because if we haven't this property, just the motivation is not enough. So we have to convince them and have an incentive tax. Okay.
Thank you. I think it's interesting, just a prerogative of the moderator, to just point out some threads that might run through these presentations. That a lot of them are about challenges, but some of them are about strengths. I think it's really interesting that Julie pointed out the translation from into English is a little tricky. That the agreement is between a qualified NGO or a government agency and essentially an NGO and another organization. There are challenges in some places like Chile where our private land conservation agreement can be between two people, and so that thread in terms of who are the parties to the agreement is something to sort of pay attention to. We're going to hear about incentives, or lack thereof. So it's, money is about creating incentives for landowners to do this, and Julie immediately pointed that out. I think it's also interesting that there is public recognition by the government of private protected areas to advance France's commitment to 30 by 30, which does not exist in all geographies around the world. Now we're going to hear from Brice Caillé, who's going to talk about Quebec.
Thank you, Henri. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone else. So my name is Brice Caillé, and I'm the executive director of the Réseau de Milieux Naturels Protégés. You can also say RMN if it's easier for you. And basically, we are the Quebec Land Trust Alliance, and we have no more than 75 land trusts in our réseau. So today, I will speak about conservation agreement in Quebec, and I will start sorry, by quick pictures of that. So in Quebec, we have few tools for protected private land, and we protect, with the land trust community, almost 80,000 hectares of land in private land. I will always refer to private land when I speak, so I will not use it anymore. And most of the protected area in private land are by fee simple. As you can probably not see on the pie chart, is the biggest part. It's 69%, and that means the land is owned by the land trust. So the land trust has to own the land by buying it, by receive as donation. So it's our main tool. And if we speak more about conservation agreements, our main tool is the servitude de conservation, or in English, conservation easement, but it's not really like conservation easement in the rest of Canada or in the common law jurisdiction. And it represents 20% of the land protected in Quebec. Our third main tool is nature reserve, and it's basically a conservation easement between the owner of the land owned by the landowner, and the Quebec government through the environment minister. So that's our main tool in use in Quebec, and we have few other tools like personal easement or forest conservation easement, but it's not really used by now. So the thing who is interesting about Quebec, I guess, is we are special, okay? Not only because we speak French, it's related, but it's from our French colonization. We are the only province in Canada who use the civil law. And I was about to say we are the only province in North America to use it, but it's not true. Louisiana uses also the civil law. So as you can see on the map, we have to deal with our colleagues from the rest of Canada and governmental federal governments who use mostly common law. So they don't understand really for the specific situation for Quebec. And that came with some challenges, so we have to deal with it. And it's a bit exciting, but it's sometimes a bit difficult. So I hope this slide will set the table for my colleague from Chile and Mexico, how conservation easements work in Quebec. So I will start with the right of the pictures with common law. In common law, you don't need a dominant land to establish conservation easement. The conservation easement will be like the ORE in France, from the land from piece of land to the land trust mission, to the land trust. So you don't need to own a land clause to establish it. But in Quebec, we need to use servitude de conservation réelle et perpétuelle. And that means the agreement must be from a piece of land to another piece of land, not from a piece of land to a land trust or a personal person. So as you can see on the left now, if you check the red square, it's the servient land, and the blue square is the dominant land. So that's the two pieces of land you need to establish a conservation easement. They don't need to be side by side, but they have to be close enough, because to be effective, the servient land must provide direct benefits to the dominant land, and you must be able to demonstrate a strong ecological link between two pieces of land. Typically, this link can be the same habitat for a specific species at risk, connection by water stream, or this kind of stuff. And obviously, as the opposite of the common law jurisdiction, we need a dominant land. So if the land trust do not own a land in an area, unfortunately, conservation easement is not an option. So that's come with some funding application in Quebec. And it's challenging for Quebec Land Trust because, as you probably heard Catherine say this morning, we have the strongest support from the provincial government across Quebec. And trust me, if you ask to our colleagues from Alberta, from Ontario, from British Columbia, they are jealous of us for that. So I will use this to explain these challenges. Despite this support, we have some difficulties, some challenge to access to federal funds. And that's because we are in a federal country. So when we apply to grants on a Canadian level, we are in competition, or we apply at least, because we are not really in competition, but we apply to the same grants as our colleagues from Ontario, BC, Alberta, etc. And most of the time, because we are a really strong community in Canada, we have more projects that they are funded in the grants. So you have to select which project will be funded. And most of the time, because 30 by 30, the main criteria for selection will be the cost per hectare. And as I said, if we don't own a land in a specific area, conservation easement is not an option. So we have to buy the land, and it's more expensive than conservation easement. So we have difficulties to fund our project. And the other main reason for that is, once again, the colonization of Canada. Start through the Saint Laurent River, just over there. So our land are smaller than in the rest of Canada, and most of the time they are more expensive than in the rest of Canada. So when we ask for money to the federal level, it's difficult to have this money because they have too many projects to fund, and we are not good enough to concurrence our colleagues from Alberta who have large piece of land to fund with conservation easement. So to explain that, I used the data of the last agreement we had with Quebec, who was called PPMN, for Partenariat pour la Protection des Milieux Naturels, and it was between 2020 to 2023, and it was for 53 million. So what you have to understand in the federal system, when we have grants, most of the time we need match, and most of the time it's 1-for-1. So that means if we want to use $1 from this Quebec grants, we must find at least $1 from another sources. So it can be from federal government, it can be even from American government, it can be from the private sector, it can also be from the land donation. So we have many sources, as you can see, during the whole PPMN periods, 45% of the money came from the Quebec government, and our main source of match was land donation. So thanks to the landowner who understand conservation and give their land to protect them for perpetuity. But the federal government sources of money represent only 11%. So that's difficult to match 53 million when you have access to 10% of the budget with federal money. So that's our main challenge in Quebec. That said, that's come to be the only one to use the civil law in a federal system. We use we used common law. It came with some opportunities. The ecological gift program, with basically the best tax incentive program in Canada, allow us to use personal servitude because it's the same as conservation easement in the rest of Canada. So it's useful for that. I also put on my slide recently published OECM guidelines. In fact, it's not yet done, but it will be done really soon, and it will allow us to use money to implement new tools like personal servitude, maybe like obligation réelle environnementale, maybe like derecho réel de conservation. Did I say it correctly? Okay. So we are really eager for that, and we are really eager to develop and try to implement new tools in Quebec because we will be able to use fund. It will be cheaper per hectare, so it will be probably easier to access to federal money, and it will be really, really useful for that. So that's the opportunities we have. We have committed to protect 25,000 more hectares before 2028, and we will be happy to achieve this all together with our colleagues from NCC to the smaller land trust with only volunteers. So thank you, and I give you the mic back.
Could I ask you a quick question? When you talk about creative tools, what is ACSQ?
Oh, sorry. ACSQ, Catherine spoke about that this morning. It's accélérer la conservation dans le sud du Québec, and it's the partnership we have with Quebec government and NCC and all the land trust community in Canada. So it's about 144 million till now to 2028 to protect more land in Quebec, to protect 25,000 hectares in the south of Quebec.
Thank you. Very helpful. Thank you, Brice. I'm going to wear my other hat now and talk for a second about our experience in Chile. Private land conservation is thinking about private land conservation in Latin America is not a new thing. It's been going on, 25 years is actually maybe a little short. It's been going on. There's been interest in private land conservation agreements in Latin America for maybe more than 25 years, led by a range of parties, Latin American NGOs, some interest from international NGOs, early interest from the Nature Conservancy and some others, and some interest from governments. And there have been private land conservation agreements in a range of countries in Latin America over this period. They were mostly servidumbres. They used the closest thing to easement law in civil law, which is the use of servitudes. So similar to what Brice is doing in Quebec, and those agreements worked pretty well. I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges in using them, which led to in part, motivated us to create a different tool. But there's never, for many years, there really wasn't the same momentum in the use of private land conservation agreements in Latin America as there was with this sort of phenomenal success of conservation easements in the United States and Canada, and the growth of conservation covenants in Australia, and complex private land conservation agreements in South Africa, which are all common law countries, by the way. But Latin America just has a different history, and it is a history that is really defined by the displacement of indigenous communities from their land, which led to a whole set of very significant, complex, often intractable problems and challenges: poverty, socioeconomic struggles, lack of a stable rule of law, lack of secure tenure and title caused by displacement of people from their land, and that made creating successful voluntary conservation agreements much more challenging. And that's a big generalization, but I think there's a good deal of truth to it. There was also sometimes a disconnect. You have countries in Latin America, like, for instance, Argentina and Chile, that have a high percentage of privately owned land, but the tools and the approach to land conservation in these countries was really dominated by the creation of public protected areas and public land conservation strategies. So it was a little bit, as we say in English, like a square peg in a round hole. Sometimes you just didn't have the kind of tools that countries that had large amounts of privately owned land needed. There's also the challenge of years of experience with creating these agreements in common law jurisdictions and trying to apply a common law tool to civil law to a civil legal system. And again, there's a disconnect. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. Chile, the country that I have spent a lot of time working on private land conservation, voluntary conservation agreements, was and is an appropriate place to test and pilot new private land conservation agreements. This is a country that is 80% in private land ownership. And when we started our work in the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, there were virtually no tools at all available to private landowners who might be interested in taking action to protect their land. Chile is a country that, at least for a number of years now, has a stable democracy, has strong rule of law, has mature legal systems, and a great deal of interest and leadership in the legal and landowner community and in the business community in trying to advance these kinds of tools. Chile is a country that is private sector dominated, which makes sense because it's mostly privately owned, but it's dominated by 4 land-holding extractive industries: timber, fishing, mining, and agriculture. And these are all extremely export-dependent businesses, and as world markets demand greater sustainability in their commodities, Chile had some catching up to do. And so there was a kind of a natural interest in the possibility of helping these industries that owned land produce their commodities more sustainably. The organization that I work with is called Terra Austral. It was established in 2012, and it has evolved into Chile's most prominent private land conservation organization, or land trust. We worked right from the beginning to create enforceable, flexible, effective private land conservation agreements, and we kind of did this in 2 stages on 2 tracks. It seems smooth now, but it was anything but smooth at the time. We started out working with what we had, which was to work with servidumbres to use easement law and servitudes, and we did protect one major, a large ecosystem scale property in Patagonia using servitudes, but as Brice described very clearly, there are challenges to using this kind of agreement, in particular because of the requirement of a servient and a dominant landowner that are property that in our case needed to be adjacent. And there was also some concern in the legal community that these agreements might be vulnerable to some legal challenge at some point, because civil law does rely not completely, but significantly on statute. And these agreements were being used for conservation purposes. They were easements or servidumbres being used for conservation purposes when the statute didn't state explicitly that they could be used for conservation purposes. So there was some concern that they might be vulnerable to some legal challenge. So our longer term goal was to create enabling legislation to create a more secure, flexible, enforceable private conservation law that would be grounded in civil law. And the idea of what is called a derecho real de conservación, or a real right or a real law of conservation, it was conceived by a lawyer in Chile in 2007 and 8. And was introduced in Congress, took 8 years, long, difficult years to pass, was signed into law in 2016. The underlying idea behind the Derecho Real de Conservación, or a DRC, was to create a private lands conservation law that was wholly grounded in Chile's civil legal system, not to sort of graft the idea and the concept of a conservation easement from common law onto civil law, but to create a strong language in the civil law that allowed this kind of agreement. And we did this by amending Chile's civil law in Congress. This is only the 4th time in the country's history that this has ever happened, so it was a long and difficult slog to get it done. And the law is actually very, very simple. Getting it done wasn't simple, but the law itself is simple. It really just changes the language slightly under the definition of private property ownership in the civil law to say that private property can be owned for the benefit of the property owner, but can be also owned for conservation purposes, which then implies that it is being owned and managed for conservation for the greater good of the Chilean society. So again, the Derecho Real de Conservación is it's now embedded in Chile's civil law, so it's secure, it is enforceable, it is also flexible. It is an in rem agreement. It doesn't require the properties to be adjacent, so the parties can be the landowner and a land trust or government agency that is not located right next door. It also is an in gross agreement. It runs with the land, not the landowner, so it can be enforceable on subsequent landowners. The parameters of the law is written very generally, which is both an advantage and has some challenges. But the advantage is that it is written so broadly that you can essentially create a conservation easement contract within the parameters of the law, so you can create an agreement that looks very much like a conservation easement in the States or in Canada, or a conservation covenant in Australia. DRCs do and can accommodate sustainable income producing land uses at forestry, agriculture, ecotourism. And the law has attracted a fair amount of attention from around the world as having the potential to be a model for a private land conservation agreement in any civil law jurisdiction. This hasn't necessarily happened, although there's now some spreading of the word, but there's a lot of interest in the legal community in the possibility that it could. So once we passed the law, it took a while for the law to really be used. This has all been a long process. For some period after the passage of the law, the law wasn't codified. There wasn't a lot of detail. So Chair Austral and partners began to establish, write up best practices, create a legal template for the agreement, create a process for creating baselines, doing monitoring, thinking about enforcement, all the things we do with conservation easements and covenants. But nobody had any money, and the government was really not the least bit interested in any of this. And so we really didn't have the ability to go out and meet and cultivate landowners. We also didn't have any financial incentives. We tried and talked about having financial incentives connected to the passage of the law, but that was really too ambitious, and we weren't able to do that. Our organization, Chair Austral, in 2019 and 20 was successful in securing, finally, some funding, significant funding from the BHP Foundation in Australia, which enabled us to build our organization and then function like a lot of other land trusts, any other land trusts, go out and cultivate landowners and begin to complete Derecho Real de Conservación agreements. We are a science-based, science-driven land trust, so we created, in particular, a habitat corridor comprised of Mediterranean habitat stretching from Santiago to the Pacific Ocean that we worked on. And we were able, after 20-odd years of work, to secure modest financial incentives for tax incentives for the donation of a Derecho Real. Roberto Peralta, a tax lawyer who's not here, but was instrumental. He's at this meeting. He was instrumental in securing that breakthrough. And so now, instead of just having to talk about this work, we're actually protecting land. It's really very exciting. We are a national land trust, so we work throughout the country. We work in Patagonia. We're now working in northern Chile. But our major conservation priority is Chile's Mediterranean habitat. Chile is one of the only 5 countries in the world with Mediterranean habitat. It is by far the rarest, the least protected, and the most threatened habitat in the country. So that has been our priority, but we work on other projects as well. We have now closed 14 DRCs, but we have 20-odd DRCs in very active negotiations. So this is, we're up and running. We're also now beginning to work on larger, more ambitious ecosystem scale, large landscape projects that combine a mixture of fee and ownership and DRC agreements, working with, in collaboration with the government, which is exciting. We've got all kinds of challenges, but just a few of them is that our financial incentives are modest. They need to be bigger. They need to be tested. It can't just be about tax incentives. We need to create public-private funding to compensate landowners in some case for taking action to protect their land. We cannot do this alone. We have ambitious goals about creating a private land conservation movement in Chile, but we're not going to be able to do it with one land trust and then a few fledgling land trusts. We need much more private land conservation capacity created in this country, and we need it soon. There are already signs of people learning how to sort of game the system, in particular in the real estate industry. So there have been abuses in the use of DRCs, and so we are continually trying to both create and model and disseminate best practices for the use of the agreement. that is my, my talk. And now we're going to hear from Roberto de la Maza, who is going to talk about the experience of the state of Sonora and Mexico and a little bit of the larger Mexican experience.
Good morning. My name is Roberto de la Maza, and I work at a consultancy firm that does consultancy on environmental policy and law in Mexico. And what I am going to present to you is exactly one of the projects that we collaborated. So I am going to talk about a series of amendments to strengthen voluntary conservation in Mexico, and one of these amendments was the incorporation of real right of conservation, or DRC, as an agreement to strengthen the conservation commitment by owners. So first I want to explain about voluntary conservation areas, or ADVCs, as we call them in Mexico. They are public, private, or collectively owned properties, land properties, that are voluntarily destined to the conservation of biodiversity, and they are officially recognized by the National Commission of Protected Areas as a type of federal protected area. We have a little bit more than 15 years of certifying properties as ADVCs, and they have proven that they not only strengthen, but they also complement federal protected areas. They also reduce conflicts because they are flexible and self-regulated, and they also help comply with international goals, such as Target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Currently, there are 595 ADVCs certified by CONAMP in Mexico, which cover a little bit more than 1 million hectares. We can get an idea of this if we look at the upper right side of my slide. You can see in red the state of Querétaro, which has a similar surface. So we can see the importance of ADVCs in terms of surface for Mexico, particularly if we want to accomplish Target 3 of Kunming-Montreal Agreement. Now, the state of Sonora has only 12 ADVCs, which cover a little bit more than 50,000 hectares, yet it is the second largest state in Mexico. We can see it in the lower part of my slide. So it has great potential to contribute to the conservation of biodiversity with voluntary initiatives to protect properties. However, to increase the conservation of biodiversity through voluntary initiatives in Sonora, we require the strengthening of complementary local mechanism that is similar to ADVCs, like something similar to ADVCs, but that are certified by the state government, by the Environmental Commission in the state of Sonora. We also need the creation of a conservation agreement that strengthens the compromise of owners, especially if we want to give incentives to them. And finally, we need to establish incentives at the state level. So on July the 1st, 2024, the amendments promoted by SEDES, the State Commission of Environment, with the support of the State Congress and the Wildlands Network and the Resources Legacy Fund were published. These amendments have the objective to strengthen and encourage voluntary conservation in the state of Sonora, and they are considered a comprehensive amendment because they included, first, the strengthening of the conservation areas, or ACs, that is this similar figure to ADVCs, but at a state level. And I want to explain the differences and the similarities between ACs and ADVCs. First, state ACs go beyond federal ADVCs because at the state level, we established that the minimum term of the compromise that owners agreed to for the conservation of their properties is 25 years. In the case of federal ADVCs, it's only for 15 years. In this way, we try to accomplish this recommendation issued by the IUCN that long-term agreements for private conservation must be at least for 25 years. Another similarity between ADBCs and ACs is another difference, and this is very important, is that ADBCs at a federal level are considered a federal protected area. In the case of ACs, they are not considered as a federal protected area. So now they are being considered as an other OECM, which is other effective area-based conservation measure. And now they are similar in two things. They are both self-regulatory and flexible. And this is very important because this affects when we want to give them incentives, because they are so flexible that in both cases, they can only commit their properties for 99 years. But at any time, owners can exercise their property rights and they can revoke the certificates. So they can get out from the compromise at any moment. So for this reason, it was necessary to, before establishing incentives, to create these private agreements in the form of the DRC to strengthen the compromise of landowners. Now, just like Henry explained, the DRC is this power that has the owners of land to sign DRC contracts with third parties. Third parties can be, in the case of Mexico, physical persons, individuals, also juridical persons, and in the case of juridical persons, they can be public or private. And in the case of private, ideally would be NGOs that focus on environmental protection. Now, DRC has very important characteristics. First, it is self-regulatory, so the owners have the power to decide to sign these DRC contracts. It is inseparable, so if the owner sells the land, the DRC goes, it's transferred to the new owner. It is indivisible, so if the land is separated into different, it is subdivided, the DRC would go to the parts resulting from the subdivision. It is also, it could be free or onerous, and this will be agreed by the parties when they sign the DRC contract. It is opposable to third parties, and this was very important because it gives additional protection for landowners to their commitment to preserve biodiversity. And for this reason, the signing of the contracts must be done with a notary, and they must be registered in the public registry of land. And finally, it is for an indeterminate term, which can be permanent, but this will be determined also in the contract. And this is exactly the reason that we decided to incorporate the DRC to our law, because if you have a DRC contract, it is less flexible because you have to respect the term that you established in the contract. Now, it is also very important to understand the difference between DRC and easement. First, the DRC is based on the power of owners to sign the DRC contracts. It's self-regulatory. It seeks to value the biodiversity that is present in the properties, and it aims, and it does not require another property. While in the case of easements, at least in civil law countries, they are traditionally considered as a lien imposed on one property for the benefit of another. So you need two properties, and it affects the value of the property. So in Sonora, we have both figures. You can use an environmental easement or you can use DRC, it depends on the situation. But what we've seen is that in Sonora, not many people wanted to use the environmental easement because of this reason that you needed two properties. And the third thing that was added to this, to the Sonora environmental law and to the tax law of municipalities in Sonora was the inclusion of incentives, 3 types of incentives. The first is the possibility that municipalities grant a differentiated reduction on property tax. For example, if you are the owner of a property that is certified as an AC or a federal ADBC, and if you commit, if you commit at least 80% of the surface of your land to the conservation of biodiversity, and you also sign a DRC contract with non-profit organizations for at least a period of 30 years, you can get a reduction of the 80% of the tax, property tax. This incentive would be very interesting for private land. This doesn't work for collective land, which are usually indigenous communities, agrarian communities, whom they don't really pay much of property tax. The other incentive is the strengthening of the state environmental fund, which already existed, but did not consider the possibility to fund the establishment, management of ACs or ADBCs in the state of Sonora. And the third is the possibility that SEDES, the State Environmental Authority, authorizes the use of labels in products or services made or rendered in ACs, so they can be they can have this added value in markets that have some more environmental conscious. No? So finally, right now SEDES is updating the regulations to apply these amendments. It is also developing the formats and guides to integrate AC management strategies. It is also designing information to promote the recognition of ACs. It is preparing the DRC contract model, just like they did in Chile. And it's promoting the signing of the first DRC contracts. For this last point, Wildlands Network negotiated with ADBC Parque La Colorada, which has a little bit more than 100 hectares, but it is very interesting because it's beside a town that is growing a lot, so it has a lot of pressure of urban development to be one of the first to sign this contract, and also with Reserva Jaguar del Norte, which is 23,000 hectares, so this one is a big one. And probably in a few months, they will be the first one to sign these contracts. As next steps, SEDES, the State Environmental Authority, requires help to promote the application of the reduction of the property tax with municipalities. Ideally, we will try to do this with the municipalities where this ADBC, La Colorada and Reserva Jaguar del Norte are located. Propose mechanisms to guarantee that the State Environmental Fund has financial resources to fund the establishing and management of ACs. Elaborate a manual for the use of the labels that we're proposing. And finally, make these amendments known between different actors, so just like we did with Derecho Real de Conservación, they can be adapted and replicated. I think it will be very helpful if the organizations here present could help us with some of these things that needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I only have like 50 questions to ask you about that. We're now going to hear finally from Matthias Brummer, who comes to us from Catalonia in Spain.
Hello and thank you. Okay, so next slide. Okay, first of all, who of you knows exactly where Catalonia is in Spain? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay, 7. And if I say Barcelona? Okay, a little bit more. Okay, so it's basically 1/5 of the county of Quebec around Barcelona, where we are based. And to situate yourselves, we are the Catalan Network for Nature Conservation. We have 200 member organizations, and our mission would be to secure just socio-ecological transition in Catalonia, and we basically do that through volunteering and stewardship for our members, not trying to promote that. Okay, so what are we talking about in our case? Basically, it's a voluntary agreement between a stewardship organization, which can be public or private, and a landowner, who again can be public or private. The stewardship organization must have within its mission the conservation and protection of nature. And as such, it's written in our civil law that only those can be stewardship organizations. And as it's voluntary, as well, all the different contract points are negotiated between the parties, meaning as well the duration. So we don't have contracts in perpetuity, but they usually last, and you see that on the bottom, 10 years, more or less. And we know a bit how the landscapes looks like in terms of stewardship in Catalonia, because every 2 to 3 years, since now I think 15 years more or less, we make an inventory on how the landscape looks like. And with that, we can say that we have more or less 800 stewardship contracts in Catalonia, of which 500 are on private land and 300 are on public land. And the average surface is of 5 hectares. It's quite small because Mediterranean landscapes are quite fragmented, and yeah. Exactly, that's it. And on top of that, 72% is within the Natura 2000 sites, which is the public network in Europe to protect nature. And that's not casual, because usually the funding from the state, if we have for stewardship, obviously goes directed to those regions, and the NGOs, if they want money, then they of course go to those places, right? And the picture you see on the top right, you don't see much. That's not the objective. It's simply to show you that it's not that easy, no? I said it's a collaboration between a landowner and an NGO, but of course there can be involved universities, civil society in terms of volunteering, companies who fund it or do CSR, so on and so forth. And the picture on the bottom, that would be Catalonia, which is at the top northeast part of Spain. Stewardship is not the greens, which is huge, that's the Natura 2000 sites, but the little lila pinkish one. Okay, but how did we get here? So this idea basically was around before the official creation of the concept in the 80s and 90s already. And then little by little in the 2000s, based on they did a first like a congress on stewardship in Montesquieu, which is like an emblematic congress, because there they said, okay, we have seen what in the US has been done through the land trusts and so on. So let's come together and create a network. So in 2003, we have the XCT, which is XCN before the thing that happened in 2019. I don't want to jump ahead. So in this initial phase, there were only 23 member organizations. By little, it kept growing, and actually in 2006, it was recognized as of public utility. So the state or the regional government of Catalonia already gave it a value, and that as well, because as in Chile, in Catalonia, a lot of the land is privately owned. I lied to you, but I think it's as well between 70 and 80% of the land is privately owned. So it makes lots of sense to doing stewardship. Then in 2017, we managed to pass through in the civil law what I stated to you, what a stewardship organization can be and who can be involved in those contracts. And then you see basically on the bottom right, I placed 2017 and the number of contracts that have been established. That you see the line of how many have been signed over time, and you see a drop. 5 minutes, good. Okay, you see a drop, and that drop basically is because before it's like those drawers where you have thousands of cables, and you don't know really what cable is useful for what thing. And basically, making this civil law helped us to organize it, and that's why we had a little drop on those years. Then we fused together with the volunteering network of Catalonia, and that broadened our mission to be able now to have a public register for stewardship organizations, and hopefully we will have some tax incentives soon. At the moment, what we have is for stewardship organization, as I said, some public funding in order to implement, especially in Natura 2000 site, stewardship initiatives. Okay, and where are we? What are our challenges? Of course, funding is one as for everybody, but I wanted to highlight some other ones which maybe are not that obvious always. For the first one and obvious one still is the permanence of the contract, because as I told you, it's 10 years what we have, and we have a lack of incentive in order to make derechos reales de conservación parcial, which we do have in our law. But if you're a landowner and you can choose between making a stewardship contract and a DRC, you maybe first go for the easy one and then you see how it goes. Then we neither have official recognition of in the OECMs and privately protected areas. We have done an analysis of how they could be recognized, but it's yet not in place. Then, of course, funding, as I said, and we are quite big network with 200 members for quite small regions. And we like to say that we have a landscape of small and medium-sized enterprise like conservation landscape, meaning that we have lots of small NGOs and some medium-sized NGOs, and the challenge lies in looking that the smaller ones don't lag behind, especially now that more public funding came in through the Next Generations Fund after the COVID pandemic. And finally, monitoring, because we have 800 agreements, we know where they are, we know who are making those agreements, but the obvious challenge is how are they actually contributing to nature conservation. We make basically interviews to our members and ask them how they think it's evolving, but we don't have objective data ourselves from our members on how it is feasibly going, and we are trying to develop a platform in order to advance on that. And I think soon my time will go. So my last slide, opportunities, and something quite exciting, what I'm quite excited about, is that in Europe we have the luck of having European funding for projects, usually for 4 to 5 years, where you have the co-finance, usually 40%. And we have now in Spain a project of 1.7 million from this year onwards for 4 years, which, if I have to sum up the slide, tries to implement the 4 pillars that we are having in the ILCN Congress at a Spanish level. So we are trying to boost policy national-wide, to strengthen the network and governance of stewardship in Spain, to internationalize the concept and what we are doing and learn from the others, like we are doing today, and bring that knowledge here, and monitoring on land stewardship in Spain. What we are trying to do in Catalonia as well, doing it nationwide, where we're conserving what, how, and how effective it is, and giving support to members to improve that. And that would be a very quick overview of what we are doing, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have later. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's always amazing to me how the presenters can present what are really, really complicated projects and agreements steeped in the legal systems of their country in a second language. It's pretty remarkable, and so I thank you. I have some questions, but I think let's open it up and kind of go with the flow, because we have time. And do people want to start? Roberto.
I'm from Luxembourg, similar to the derecho real. I don't know what you've done in Catalonia and Spain. Is similar to that or not?
And also, Julie from France can also speak to this.
Okay, now. What we have in Catalonia, we actually have both. So we have the derecho real de conservación parcial as in France. It's basically more or less the same. Let's say it's the same to simplify it. But at the same time, we have, and that's like in the 5th book of the civil codes. My lawyer, the lawyer of Ixien would explain it way better than I do. I'm a little like the voice taker. But at the same time, we have the stewardship contracts, and we have a model that we in Ixien developed, and the difference is that one is bound to the land, and the other one is between individual persons, between individuals, and not bound to the land, which makes it more easier to take for the landowners, I'd say. I don't know if that answers your question, more or less.
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to know whether, because it was news for me to learn that in addition to the traditional servitude that exists in all our civil codes, that in France now, which is the inspiring code for our civil code, they have this new legislation on special regime for this, similar to the derecho real. So I just wanted to know whether it's similar or not to the one we know.
Julie, do you want to speak to that?
I'll try.
Just so we're going to ask the technical person asked us if we can repeat the question, so we don't have to pass the microphone around, so that you people get a sense of what the question was. And so Roberto's question was about the possible creation of an agreement in France that is similar to a derecho real de conservación, in addition to servitude, to servidumbre agreements in France and in Barcelona. So Matthias responded about Catalonia, and now Julie will talk about France.
Technically, in France, you can create servitude between two lands, but it doesn't have a specific regime. I don't know. It's a good way to see. But the conservation easements are really specific, and I think it's the tools you were thinking. We use it, and it's like a derecho real because it's on the land and not between two persons. So it's hard to agree this contract. But when you have it, it's a long-term story.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question about how you enforce those conservation agreements with owners. And have you had instances where the owners do not respect the contract? And how do you go through legal action to make sure there's reparation, or what's your experience?
So the question was whether the panelists and their projects on the ground have experienced violations of the agreements that are being entered into, and then what actions have they taken in the event of these violations. I don't know who wants you want to take that, Roberto?
I knew this was going to be a question. In the case of Sonora, as I mentioned, this is new. We haven't signed our first DRC contracts, but I can anticipate that this is going to be a problem, and especially in Mexico, because Henry mentioned it, that one positive thing about Chile is that it is a law-abiding country.
Yeah.
They're strong in enforcing laws, and in Mexico, we're not so strong in that. No, So this is going to be a problem. Yesterday, I was talking to a colleague from the States, from United States, where they have, for many years, promoted the signing of environmental easements, and she was telling me that they are facing this problem in the States. And I was surprised because I know that in the States they are strong in enforcing this kind of agreements, or at least a lot more stronger than in Mexico. And I think the answer is as it is a contract, you will have to go to sue the how do you say incumplimiento? The not compliance with the contract. And in the case of Mexico, it is going to be a very long and problematic process that in Mexico we have a saying that it is better to negotiate than go to courts, no? But I think that even though it is going to be very difficult, it is much better to sign these contracts than do not sign them, yes? Probably we will lose some of them in this problematic of enforcement, but there will be many others that will work correctly, so it is better to have them. And I think it would be interesting that some other of my colleagues answer because they have more experience applying these contracts.
Yeah, Brice, I'd be really interested in knowing about how you deal, whether you have violations, and if so, how you're dealing with them in Quebec.
Yeah, sure. I will speak specifically about servitude de conservation. And it's the responsibility of the land trust who are the owner of the dominant land. And to do that, we have best practice to use. And when we receive as a gift or when we buy a servitude de conservation, we have to create an endowment fund with like 20% of the fair market value to produce interest each years, and we can be able to use it for stewardship. So stewardship can be monitoring the land and even take action in justice if we need it. To be honest, that's not a huge challenge, I guess, now, but it will become a challenge when the owner of the land will change in the future. Because right now, most of the owner of the servitude de conservation are the one who sign it. So they are willing, they know why they did it, so that's not a huge problem. But when it will change because they will sell the land or give it to their son or whatever, it can become a challenge. So our main protection for that is creating an endowment fund at the beginning of the process and put money in it. But it's still a challenge because conservation easement is cheaper than buying land. And the endowment fund is based on the value of the fair market value. So on the long term, it's more expensive to manage servitude de conservation instead of owning a land. So it can become a challenge, but that's the solution we use now.
I think it's a very, very good question for all of us in all of our geographies. So I can speak for both Chile and the United States in saying that in the United States, land trusts live in fear constantly of a property protected with a conservation easement passing to the next generation or to somebody who buys the property, and that person either doesn't read the deed carefully enough or doesn't care or is actually openly hostile to the conservation decision by the previous owner and violates the conservation easement. Again, it's been remarkable how few violations there are in the United States and in Canada, given the number of easement agreements, but they're happening and they're going to increase over time. And the approach is to create is to monitor the properties for compliance, to create a fund, a monitoring and enforcement fund. The monitoring is less expensive than the enforcement if the land trust needs to take legal action in the event of a violation, which can wipe out the land trust. The Land Trust Alliance in the United States has had this fantastic idea of creating an insurance program for legal defense in the event of a violation. And we in Chile we're wrestling with the same issues. we have the challenge that our landowners might be willing to do a derecho real de conservación, but they don't want to create a monitoring fund, and we're ending up having to raise that money from other places. One really, really interesting thing that's happened to us in Chile that we don't talk about enough, and that is something for all of you to consider doing, is we have an agreement with a nonprofit called the Pro Bono Foundation, which is just that. It's a group of very prominent law firms in Chile, in Santiago, who do pro bono work, and we have an agreement with them that they will provide legal defense to our land trust and to our DRC agreements in the event of a violation. We haven't had any violations. We haven't had to test that agreement yet and see how well they do for us. But it has enabled us, at least for the time being, not to have to create a big legal enforcement fund to enforce violations of our DRCs. Other questions?
Andrew, just supplementing that, I think it's important, there's some advantages in the civil law jurisdictions, because penalties in civil, at least in Chile, and in civil law countries, I don't know if here in Quebec the same thing, but penalties are enforceable. I understand in common law they're not enforceable, the penalties by themselves. And the way we have the most powerful tool to enforce the derecho real de conservación is with penalties. You set up a very relevant penalty, and that you can, and if you have the right legal document, for example, a public deed, then it's very quick to enforce. So sometimes there are tools that are very helpful.
Other questions? I have a question for you, Brice, which I'm curious about. In Quebec, you're working with conservation easements that require a dominant and a servient landowner. Have you tried legally to have that requirement removed? Would it be possible legally to try to work with the authorities to remove that requirement so that you could have a donation to an NGO or a government agency that doesn't own the land next door?
It's a tricky question.
Well, that's why I asked it.
Yes, we did, and in fact, we can use it. That we have personal servitude, and that we can go through the ecological gift program for a personal servitude, for example, but it's not recognized as protected area in Quebec right now. I hope it will change with OECM guidelines, but for now, we can't use money from Quebec to create personal servitude because there is some issues with the long-term question. The concept came from the NAGO in specific question, but the thing came from the Napoleon Code Civil, and it's because you can't be the serf anymore of someone. So you can put a servitude personnel on a land to a moral person, and if you go from a land to a land trust, by definition, the land trust is perpetual, because if he disappeared, he must give his land to another land trust with similar mission. But what's happened, in case of dominant land, the dominant land will go to someone else and stay protected because it will stay the dominant land and owned by a land trust. But what's happened if the servitude is to the mission of the land trust? Can it be transferred? We have no answer to that. So that's the answer.
That is interesting and complicated.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
I can just add a comment on that. Like the personal servitude in Quebec would work a bit as covenant or easement in the other provinces of Canada. And I think the big difference between the tools that were presented here is that you're really buying the rights on the land. So you have to compensate financially the landowner. I saw many volunteer agreements there, and that's fine because we have this big toolbox to conserve lands. But like in Quebec, it's like more that we're trying to do similarly to covenant, so in perpetuity, and you subdivision or no forest exploration, exploitation, or things like that.
Gives you more
So you
control.
value,
Yeah.
you need a fair market value of the asset that you're donating or buying.
I want to ask, we're kind of out of time, which is fine. This has been very, very interesting, and I really, really thank you. But I want to ask a question about the ILCN, and that is this network that we have in the ILCN. How do you think the ILCN might be helpful to your work with the kinds of challenges that you're facing and the kinds of opportunities that you're looking at, the kinds of work that the ILCN does? Where are the places where you think the ILCN might be able to help you? And anyone can take this. Roberto.
I would say that promoting and making known the amendments of Sonora, because we're going to face a challenge that is, now we have the amendments, they are enforceable, but now we have to apply them. And so we need to let them know within Sonora, but also in other states in Mexico, so they can also adapt and replicate. And I would say that it also will be useful for other provinces, states, or countries in the world. So I think that could be something that the ILCN could help, letting these amendments known.
So using our voice to promote and disseminate the information about the existence of these laws. Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
And I will also add that we also need to, because in the application of these amendments, we also need to adapt administrative regulations. So we need also to learn from experience that maybe you have in France, or in Quebec, or in Catalonia, or in other countries, that you have already done that, and it could be useful for the Sonora case.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, when we heard that, something that is just always, I always find kind of amazing, is that we worked for however many years to create the Derecho Real de Conservación in Chile, and it turned out that in Catalonia, XCN was doing the same thing, and we didn't talk to each other. We didn't know that we were doing that. I think in the era of the ILCN, we would have known that. And so it's very interesting. I thank all of you for coming, especially thank our panelists. This was really interesting. My head is spinning. I have lots more questions, but thank you. Let's go have lunch.